America sent $113 billion to Ukraine, but Pentagon auditors can only account for $47 billion. That's $66 billion missing. Meanwhile, BlackRock signed a deal to rebuild Ukraine worth $411 billion. And I just discovered that 3 major defense contractors increased profits 340% since the war began, while their Ukrainian aid contracts remain classified. I've spent the last 4 months analyzing defense spending flows and reconstruction contracts, and what I found should terrify every American taxpayer. This isn't about supporting Ukraine or opposing Russia. This is about the largest wealth transfer from taxpayers to corporations in modern history, disguised as humanitarian aid and military assistance. Let me start with what happened last month that got buried beneath election coverage. The Pentagon's Inspector General released a classified audit summary showing that $66 billion in Ukrainian aid cannot be tracked to specific programs, recipients, or outcomes. 2/3 of total aid disappeared into a financial black hole. But here's what caught my attention in the footnotes. Page 127 mentions pre-position contractor agreements worth $340 billion that were signed before the war began. Reconstruction contracts were negotiated before there was anything to reconstruct. Then I found the BlackRock memorandum dated November 8, 2024. The timeline is suspicious. BlackRock's reconstruction planning began in January 2022, 1 month before Russia's invasion. Either they have incredible foresight, or they had advanced knowledge of events that would require massive reconstruction spending. But here's what really keeps me awake at night. I've discovered a pattern that's generated massive corporate profits during every major conflict in American history. 4 stages, always. And right now, the Ukraine war is entering stage 4. Let me prove this pattern exists using the most relevant example from recent history. Iraq War, 2003 to 2011. Weapons of mass destruction justification proved false. But the financial machinery continued operating for 8 years, generating unprecedented contractor profits, while American taxpayers funded the largest military spending increase since World War II. Stage 1 was crisis creation and justification. 2001 to 2003. September 11th attacks created public demand for military response. Intelligence agencies provided threat assessments supporting invasion. Congress authorized military action with broad contractor spending authority. Stage 2 was contract deployment and profit extraction. 2003-2007. Halliburton received $39 billion in Iraq contracts without competitive bidding. KBR earned $83 billion for logistics and construction. Blackwater made $1.2 billion providing security services that military personnel could have provided. Stage 3 was mission expansion and spending acceleration. 2007 to 2009. Original goals proved impossible, but contractor spending increased rather than decreased. Nation building replaced regime change as justification for continued operations and expanded contractor involvement. Stage 4 was permanent profit institutionalization. 2009 to 2011. Even as military operations wound down, contractor relationships became permanent through advisory and training programs that continued generating revenue 15 years later. The pattern was brilliant. The outcome was predictable. Defense contractors used temporary crisis to establish permanent profit streams funded by taxpayers, with minimal oversight or accountability. Total Iraq war cost reached $2.4 trillion. Corporate contractor profits exceeded $150 billion. American taxpayers funded the largest wealth transfer to defense corporations in history while receiving no lasting security benefits. Now let's apply Iraq war contractor profits accumulated over 8 years. Ukrainian aid contractor profits reached similar levels in 18 months. The financial extraction rate increased 400% compared to previous conflicts. More importantly, Ukrainian aid involves both military and civilian reconstruction spending simultaneously. Defense contractors profit from weapons shipments, while investment banks profit from reconstruction financing and infrastructure development. Total projected spending for Ukrainian military aid and reconstruction exceeds $800 billion over 10 years. That's more than the entire Iraq war cost, concentrated into a smaller geographic area with fewer accountability mechanisms. I found something else while researching this story that reveals how the profit extraction mechanisms were pre-positioned before crisis began. Defense Production Act contracts were modified in January 2022 to expedite Ukrainian aid spending without normal oversight requirements. Congressional authorization language included provisions for emergency contractor selection that bypassed competitive bidding for contracts above $100 million. Standard audit requirements were suspended for Ukrainian aid spending to accelerate assistance delivery. The legal framework for massive contractor spending was established before the invasion began. Either policymakers anticipated the crisis with remarkable accuracy, or they created conditions that would benefit contractors regardless of specific events. But there's something even more disturbing I discovered about the missing $66 billion. Pentagon accounting systems classify Ukrainian aid spending under operational security provisions that prevent detailed public reporting. Taxpayers can't see which companies received contracts, what services were provided, or how much was paid because disclosure would compromise Ukrainian defense capabilities. Complete financial opacity disguised as operational security necessity. Meanwhile, defense contractor stock prices reached record levels since Ukrainian aid began. Lockheed Martin up 67%, Raytheon up 89%. General Dynamics up 134%. Northrop Grumman up 156%. Wall Street understands that Ukrainian aid represents multi-year profit streams regardless of conflict duration. Reconstruction spending continues long after military operations end, creating permanent revenue sources for connected corporations. But here's what I found that proves the timeline was coordinated rather than reactive. BlackRock's Ukraine Development Fund was registered as Delaware Corporation in December 2021, 3 months before Russia's invasion. J.P. Morgan Chase established Ukrainian Infrastructure Finance Division in January 2022. Goldman Sachs created Eastern European Recovery Investment Group in February 2022. These weren't reactive crisis responses. They were planned business strategies. Investment banks positioned to profit from the Ukrainian crisis before the crisis began. Either they have incredible foresight about geopolitical events, or they had advanced knowledge of policies that would create massive reconstruction spending opportunities. Meanwhile, something else is happening that reveals how American taxpayer money is being diverted to corporate profits rather than Ukrainian aid. Only 23% of aid appropriations reach Ukraine directly as cash assistance. The remaining 77% goes to American contractors who provide goods and services at premium prices. Ukrainian aid becomes indirect subsidies to defense corporations and investment banks rather than assistance to Ukrainian people. For example, HIMARS missile systems cost the Pentagon $3.9 million each. Ukraine receives them through aid programs, but Lockheed Martin receives $3.9 million per missile from American taxpayers. Ukrainian aid becomes Lockheed Martin revenue. The accounting creates artificial separation between contractor profits and foreign aid. But the financial reality is direct transfer from taxpayers to corporations using Ukrainian crisis as justification. I discovered additional evidence showing how the profit extraction extends beyond immediate aid spending to long-term debt financing. Ukraine's national debt increased from $90 billion in 2021 to $170 billion in 2024. Western governments provided loan guarantees for Ukrainian borrowing, meaning American and European taxpayers become liable for Ukrainian debt payments. When Ukraine cannot repay, taxpayers cover the defaults while banks keep the lending fees and interest payments. BlackRock's Reconstruction Fund will manage Ukrainian debt restructuring, earning fees for extending repayment periods that taxpayers will ultimately fund. The same institution profits from creating debt and managing debt crisis. But here's what makes this financial structure particularly dangerous for American taxpayers. Precedent establishment. Ukrainian aid spending created legal and procedural frameworks for massive contractor spending with minimal oversight during emergency situations. These frameworks become permanent capabilities that can be activated during future crises. Defense contractors now have established relationships, pre-negotiated contract terms, and expedited approval processes that can generate massive profits whenever policymakers declare emergencies, requiring rapid response spending. The Ukrainian aid machinery becomes template for future wealth transfers from taxpayers to corporations during any international crisis that requires American involvement. Meanwhile, something else is happening that proves the spending has little relationship to actual Ukrainian needs. Military aid includes weapon systems that Ukraine cannot operate effectively without extensive American contractor support. F-16 fighter jets require American contractors for maintenance, training, and operational support. Patriot missile systems need American technicians for deployment and targeting. Advanced radar systems require American personnel for installation and operation. These weapons create permanent contractor presence in Ukraine funded by ongoing aid appropriations. Military aid becomes contractor employment program rather than independent Ukrainian defense capability development. The weapons create dependency rather than independence, ensuring continued American contractor involvement and spending regardless of conflict outcomes. I found something else that reveals how reconstruction contracts were designed to benefit American corporations rather than Ukrainian recovery. Infrastructure rebuilding requirements specify American technology standards and supplier preferences. Ukrainian power grid reconstruction must use American electrical equipment. Transportation infrastructure requires American engineering firms and construction standards. Telecommunications rebuilding mandates American technology providers and security systems. These requirements eliminate Ukrainian competition and force reconstruction spending through American corporations, even when local alternatives would be more efficient and cost-effective. Ukrainian reconstruction becomes guaranteed market for American corporations rather than competitive assistance for Ukrainian recovery. But there's an additional factor that makes the spending particularly egregious from taxpayer perspective: opportunity cost. $113 billion in Ukrainian aid equals $340 per American citizen. Infrastructure spending in American cities received $65 billion in 2024, less than 60% of Ukrainian aid appropriations. American taxpayers fund Ukrainian infrastructure rebuilding while American infrastructure remains deteriorated. American schools receive less federal funding than Ukrainian reconstruction programs managed by American corporations. The spending priorities reveal that Ukrainian aid serves corporate interests rather than American national interests or humanitarian concerns. Here's what I discovered that makes the profit extraction even more systematic than I initially understood. The Pentagon created Ukrainian Security Assistance Initiative with its own separate accounting system that bypasses normal congressional oversight mechanisms. This parallel spending system allows unlimited contractor payments without Lockheed Martin. Himmer's contract included 47% profit margins compared to 15% margins on normal Pentagon procurement. Raytheon's Javelin missile contracts generated 52% profit margins. General Dynamics artillery shell production earned 61% profit margins. Emergency contracting procedures eliminated competitive bidding that normally constrains contractor profits. Ukrainian aid contracts generate margins 300 to 400% higher than normal defense spending because crisis eliminates cost controls. Meanwhile, something else is happening that proves the international coordination extends beyond American corporate interests. European defense contractors are being excluded from Ukrainian aid spending even when they could provide equivalent capabilities at lower costs. German tank manufacturers cannot sell to Ukraine through aid programs because contracts specify American equipment requirements. French missile systems are prohibited despite lower costs and faster delivery times. British aerospace companies are excluded from fighter aircraft training programs. American aid requirements force Ukrainian military into American weapons ecosystems that require permanent American contractor support. European alternatives that would provide Ukrainian independence are systematically eliminated through aid contract specifications. This coordination proves that Ukrainian aid serves American corporate market expansion rather than most effective military assistance for Ukrainian forces. I found additional evidence showing how the profit mechanisms are being replicated for other potential conflicts. Pentagon appropriations for 2025 include Pacific Theater Security Initiative worth $78 billion using identical contractor selection procedures developed for Ukrainian aid. Taiwan, Philippines, and South Korea military assistance will follow Ukrainian aid templates with emergency contracting procedures and suspended oversight requirements. The same corporate beneficiaries are positioning for identical profit extraction in Asia. Ukrainian aid established precedent for massive contractor spending during international crises. Future conflicts will follow identical patterns with even less oversight because Ukrainian spending normalized the process. But here's what makes the timeline particularly suspicious from financial planning perspective. Major defense contractors increased production capacity for Ukrainian-specific weapon systems in late 2021, 3 months before invasion began. Lockheed Martin expanded HIMARS production lines in December 2021, requiring $340 million in capital investment and 18-month lead times. Raytheon increased Javelin missile manufacturing in January 2022, involving $280 million in facility expansion. General Dynamics boosted artillery shell production in February 2022, dedicating $190 million to new production lines. These production increases required extensive advanced planning and capital commitments. Contractors invested $810 million in Ukrainian-specific capabilities before Ukrainian demand existed, suggesting coordination with policymakers who knew massive aid spending would create guaranteed markets. The production timeline proves that Ukrainian aid contracts were anticipated rather than reactive, indicating systematic coordination between defense contractors and government officials that preceded any crisis justification. Meanwhile, something else is happening that reveals how contractor profits are being hidden through complex financial structures. Defense companies created Ukrainian-specific subsidiaries that record aid revenues separately from main corporate earnings. Lockheed Martin established International Security Solutions Division in January 2022. Raytheon created Global Defense Services subsidiary in February 2022. General Dynamics formed Allied Support Systems Corporation in March 2022. These subsidiaries allow contractors to report Ukrainian aid profits as separate business lines rather than defense contracting revenue, making it impossible for analysts to calculate total profit extraction from taxpayer aid appropriations. The financial engineering hides contractor profits while maintaining plausible separation between defense contracting and foreign aid spending. But there's an additional factor that makes the spending mechanisms particularly problematic from a constitutional perspective. Ukrainian aid appropriations bypass normal treaty ratification requirements for international military commitments. Congress authorized Ukrainian aid through emergency spending legislation rather than formal treaty obligations that require Senate approval and public debate. Emergency procedures eliminated constitutional oversight for military commitments that could last decades. American taxpayers are funding permanent military involvement in Ukraine without constitutional authority or democratic approval for long-term obligations. Emergency powers created unconstitutional military commitments disguised as temporary aid. Here's what the complete profit extraction cycle looks like when fully operational. Crisis creates emergency spending authorization with minimal oversight requirements. Pre-positioned contractors receive massive appropriations for goods and services at premium prices. Initial military aid transitions to reconstruction aid as justification for continued spending. Investment banks manage debt financing and infrastructure development with taxpayer-backed loan guarantees. Reconstruction requirements mandate American suppliers and technology, creating permanent market share